very much. So we seven are the only thing that stands between you and lunch. We'll try not to abuse that power too much as we go on here. As you already heard with the great panels this morning, we know that food waste is a major problem here in the US, and it's a major problem really for restaurants and big institutions around food as well. They're a big part of that problem because they together generate as much as 44 billion tons of food waste per year in the US, which is actually many times more than the waste created by grocery stores and retailers, for instance. Only 2%, according to one survey, of the food discarded by big national restaurant chains is actually donated. But when you have a problem with the scale that large, that leaves a lot of room for improvement, a lot of room for solutions. And the panel here, fortunate to have here, has some of the most innovative chefs, executives, and activists who are really working hard to tackle food waste at the restaurant and institutional level. You had them just introduced now, and I'll start, Dickie, with you. As a restaurateur, it's a tough enough business to begin with. So how do you work to reduce food waste? How do you tackle food waste in a way that really works, for your restaurant, for your bottom line?
Okay, so it's great to be here.
Yeah.
The food world's so exciting right now. I'm gonna try to stick on the topic.
We'll try to stick to food waste. Yeah.
Being here this morning, there's so many things I want to talk about. I think probably if we're going to move the pendulum, the biggest opportunity is portions. Mm-hmm. Restaurants traditionally, we have these huge portions, and so if we really want to do it move it, I think it's a cultural thing. And do we really need a 16-ounce New York strip? 8 ounces of a fillet of fish. So I think that's a huge opportunity. There's plenty. We need to continue to educate young men and women chefs, but we do a pretty good job of not in a kitchen having a lot of waste. I think the biggest opportunity would be in the portion control. But being here today, I think there's so much opportunity for entrepreneurs and hopefully a lot of young entrepreneurs to be in the loop. I have an example of 4 years ago, we implemented a recycling program with oyster shells. Louisiana has an epidemic coastal erosion problem. And I'm driving down to a fishing village, and there's a mound of limestone rocks that's going on oyster boats for oyster farmers to go put it in, rebuild the bed. And I'm like, there's no limestone in Louisiana. What's the cost? Who's bringing that in? And here, our oyster shells are going to a landfill. So Shell Oil Company stepped up with one of the coastal restoration groups, came up with a program, and the missing link was a restaurant is going to have someone pick it up. Where does it go? So we added in a couple of different parts of the loop that completed this feasibility program, and it was transportation. We needed someone that was going to take an oyster shell from a restaurant and bring it to an area where you can do the curing process. It's 8 months to cure an oyster. It's a natural bleaching process. And so, that was a missing link. And then how do you get it back into the water? So we now use volunteers to twice a year take these oyster shells, put them in these baskets, and they go in a big crate. And then we position them 10 or 20 yards from the coast that continues to erode. And what's happening the last 4 years is it fills in, instead of the coastline eroding, we're now rebuilding. So, the recycle, but that's created an opportunity. There's someone now that has a company that is picking up our shells, bringing them down there. It's an entrepreneur. So I'm really excited with foundations, with just the awareness of the food world through communications, the opportunity it's going to create for young entrepreneurs.
Dadisi, you're involved in consulting, designing restaurants now. Are there strategies you can think about, at the beginning when you're actually sort of setting out to create a restaurant to start from the beginning when it comes to kind of trying to reduce food waste?
Yeah, I'd probably say that the first thing you need to start with is the menu. Right? If you think about restaurants and developing kitchens, the first thing you start with is the menu design. And if the menu design is not done properly, you're not going to have a properly developed kitchen. You're not going to make the kind of revenue that you want to make in that restaurant because your menu is not designed properly. And I think part of the early discussion has to do with when you're talking about designing a kitchen and designing a menu, you have to think about things like composting. You have to think about things like food waste. You have to think about creative things that you can do with parts of produce and meats that you may ordinarily get rid of. Maybe you can create new dishes from it. So that cuts down your food waste. That allows you to be more creative as a chef and as a team working in the kitchen. And of course, from a bottom line standpoint, it helps the restaurateur and the owners be a little bit more happy with you. So that as a chef, and if there are any chefs in the audience, you'll understand this. When kitchen equipment breaks down, you want to be in a position to ask for new stuff. And one of the ways that you can do that is by saving money in other areas so that you can go back and say, okay, here's my P&L. This is what it looks like. I do need a new oven, and I need it yesterday. So I saved you this much money. I don't need an argument. Just get it for me. That's pretty much it.
Marco, you partnered with Quaker Oats, the James Beard Foundation, to actually sort of create recipes for what you called rescue foods that would otherwise be wasted. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about, and also maybe could you see that going elsewhere as well?
Sure. To his point about creating a restaurant that helps eliminate food waste, I mean some basic techniques around having a dehydrator, learning to love your freezer. I think the freezer needs a new marketing campaign. I think frozen food is like a wonderful thing that could really help mitigate against food waste. And just looking at the food chain differently and using things that aren't so popular, right? Like, 15 years ago at Gramercy Tavern, all we sold was salmon and tuna. And we all would joke, it was salmon and tuna every night. So I think, broadening what you use and as consumers being more open to things that you don't recognize can really help mitigate against it. And what Dan Barber did at the Wasted thing at Blue Hill a couple years ago, I mean, it was amazing, and I was thrilled when he asked me to come and do Brodo there. It's unfathomable how much we're throwing away and how much of that stuff is really great, and he proved it, and he continues to prove it, and that's our jobs as chef, right? To use everything, not throw away stuff, and create a little sustainable system within our own little, box that is our restaurant, and that's what everybody can do at home, and understanding dehydration and understanding why things, having an education and an understanding around why the thing is going bad will help mitigate against it as well.
Katherine, James Beard, you work with chefs. You're actually training young chefs to think about food waste. First, is that something chefs hadn't done in the past? And how do you do that? I mean, how do you sort of inculcate those lessons as young as possible when it comes to them? So when they go and they open their own restaurants in the future, they're sort of bringing those lessons to bear.
Yeah, I mean, most people know the James Beard Foundation as the Oscars of the food world, right? Like the awards. And we really doubled down over the last few years to figure out how we can be an organization that's promoting good food for good. And chefs are really, for us, at the front line of that in our core constituency. And so we both wanted to use them as an audience by which to communicate about food waste and engage them in educational components and advocacy activities and all of the other things that we need to do. But then we also wanted to use them to teach. And to teach the next generation. I will draw your attention to a flyer in your bags for our full use kitchen program, which is launching for culinary instructors around the country. It's online, it's free, thanks to Morton Salt and others and Rockefeller Foundation. And this is really our attempt to start at the very beginning. When people are in culinary school, right? When they are just starting their careers and talking to them about why reducing food waste and sustainability measures are important, but also how they can do it and incorporate it into their training. And so it's for culinary instructors, but is really open to everybody. So it's a great program. The second thing that we did this year, and it just launched, and we have a dinner at the James Beard House on October 9th related to it, is our Waste Not Cookbook. And so Marco and about 100 other chefs who are participants in our Chefs Boot Camp for Policy and Change actually created recipes that are more for the home cook. My husband and I are home cooks, right? We're not making skate wing crackers, right? As much as we would love to. right? We are making roasted chicken. We're figuring out what to do with our broccoli stems. We're figuring out how to repurpose that or not throw away that avocado that maybe looks a little off, right? And so that cookbook is really our intention to introduce that into a more consumer and household audience and make it easy and delicious. And so I would encourage all of you, Amazon.com, to purchase the book. But really for us at James Beard, it starts with the chefs as teachers and as communicators into a larger audience and really being able to move these conversations and these topics in a way that's not threatening, not preachy, right? And very practical about how we both use them in our kitchens and our training and then in our homes.
Brad, at Marriott, you're talking about like thousands of properties, a lot of restaurants, a lot of people who are served. Marriott has made a global commitment to reduce food waste, I believe 50% by 2025. And we were just talking backstage, the challenge is always like, how do you meet production to demand? When it comes to food waste, often you're overproducing and you're not getting enough demand. So how, when you're talking on that scale, how do you meet that kind of goal while ensuring that you don't have a buffet that goes empty and an unhappy hotel customer?
Well, I think that's the billion-dollar question. How do you actually do that at scale? And I think that's one of the things that we as a company are focusing on waste really as an opportunity, but not necessarily as a cost opportunity. I think one of the things that often we hear immediately is, well, you can save so much, and food waste costs X number of dollars, which it does. But effectively, we have to change that conversation so that it doesn't become just a margin discussion, because we'll always make the margins. So we've got a lot of chefs that actually don't believe they have a food waste problem because we're making the margins. So it's really changing the conversation to be around the awareness of what is happening with this product that you're buying that was intended to go for a human being, and what can we do better in planning. So it goes back to the planning, which was the initial part of your question. But the first piece really globally, we've got 6,800 hotels and growing, and we're opening one every 14 hours. And we've got 70,000 or so culinary associates. And really it's just putting the conversation in the terms that there is an issue that we can actually all collectively solve. But it's a number of different things so that we are not, I don't believe that the buffet quandary that you just posed, we will not succeed by saying to the last person that went through the buffet that last bit of every little dish or plate that they got is just as valuable as the first person that went through. So we have to actually change what the expectation is, that how we sell food and how we plan buffets, but also do that with the meeting planners and the course of groups and whatnot. But honestly, the beginning starts first in our own houses, in our own kitchens, to change the awareness of what food waste, where food waste actually is. And quite honestly, the very first step is to put another garbage can besides just the one that everything goes into. So look at things that, look at the back dock to say, where are the other places that we can actually divert food? And to look at food as, that does come off of, that is edible, and save it and be able to donate it properly. So a number of different questions, a number of different challenges, and many of them infrastructure related. But first is just awareness that this is a food recovery problem and not a food cost problem.
Joe, Brad had just mentioned donation. I talked about that at the beginning at the top of the talk. Pacific Foods, I know, has a long-standing work with donation locally in Oregon, where the company is based. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that is a huge part, I think, of this issue. Sure.
Before I get into that real quickly, just for many of you who probably don't know who Pacific Foods is, we've been in business for over 30 years. And we're the leading producer of organic soup, broth, and plant-based beverage. And we really make our products from simple, carefully sourced ingredients. And we make them in our manufacturing facility very much like you would in your kitchen, but on a slightly larger scale. Really, we make some outstanding food, and I actually tasted Marco's bone broth yesterday. It's not quite as good as Marco's, but I'll tell you, if you don't have time to do it, or if you can't stop off at Brodo, certainly our bone broth is a fabulous choice. But my personal favorite is our roasted red pepper and tomato, and if you haven't tried that, you should You should go look for it. It's just awesome.
Good plug.
Pacific Foods is
should've
a
brought props.
purpose-driven business. Our purpose is to nourish everybody, and nourishment takes a form of nourishing food that we make, but also nourishing our environment, nourishing our community. And as Bryan talks about, we've got a long-standing relationship with the Oregon Food Bank, really to help feed the hunger, feed the hungry, and go after food insecurity. 1 in 5 children in Oregon are food insecure. And we work with them very closely, like a lot of other food manufacturers, where you have excess product, you give the donation, and really go out for a really good cause. But I think what we do specifically with the Oregon Food Bank that's a little different and fairly innovative is we help them deal with some other donations that they get. So not only do we give our food, but we look for using up ingredients that they get donated to them that they really, frankly, don't know what to do with. What they do is they provide us with all the list of those potential vegetables or other produce or other ingredients that they get donated, and we work with our product development teams on custom soup formulations for them. So we'll take whatever monthly ingredient list comes in, all the food that's donated, we'll combine that with some of the ingredients that we may have in-house, and our R&D team works on designing a soup that will work with that to provide really a nutritious soup that then can go back to the Oregon Food Bank and all the rest of their food bank partners in the Northwest. We dedicate line time 2 or 3 times a month to specifically run this product. We've been doing that with them for a long time, and I think it's a great example of how we can do more than just donate our food, but help them deal with potential food loss and waste in the rest of the system.
And Joe, well, I have you, I'm curious further up the supply chain as well. When you're making your soups, your broths, that kind of food, your suppliers, do you work at all with them in terms of what kind of waste may come on their end and how you can sort of help them or encourage them to reduce that as well?
Well, certainly we think about waste, really about our sustainability program in total. So in the 30 plus years we've been in business, waste has always been a key focus. The business has always started with really trying to leave nothing behind. So we look at working with suppliers just like we would within our own operations. We work with them often on things such as how do we get input into our facility. So what are the ways that we package that input? How do we set it up such as we'll use chopped vegetables, and we get them chopped a certain way in a particular package. They come into the facility so that we can dump them in and use 100%. We also use continuous improvement teams throughout our operation that can work both with internally to what would make it better and more efficient and effective, and how would that translate into how we work with our suppliers. We also use very local sourcing. A big piece of our business is very much about local, and what local does for us is certainly it lowers our carbon footprint, but it also gives us significantly shorter lead times, and within that shorter lead time you can order smaller quantities, and with that you're less likely to run into waste. We also work very closely with our own sales and marketing teams on demand forecasting, and the tighter we get internally in our own processes allows us to order only what we need, and again, take potential for food loss or waste out of the system.
Dickie, I'm going to ask you, and maybe the other chefs on the panel can chime in as well. What about patrons? Do they, whether it's their expectations or education of them, is there anything on that end that can be addressed? Even portion size, I think we all can sort of see that portions seem to have inflated over the years in a lot of places. Anything that they can do on that side to sort of address this problem?
We feel it's part of our responsibility to try to educate customers. And I know, like our oyster shuckers, they all go out on the oyster luggers, they see the whole process. When we're serving the patron at the oyster bar, we have a map. We say where this oyster comes from, and they give a lot of information. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to share the information we have with our clientele, and we try to take as much of the opportunity as we can to do that.
And I think, what we see at Beard is a variety of approaches on the plate for chefs, right? Some chefs really want to talk about it as, hey, this is how we're reducing waste or sustainability. And some just really want to make sure that you have a delicious meal and you don't have to think about it, right? So I think about the work that you do and Steven Satterfield does and all chefs around the country, and probably you and your business as well, who it's just delicious when you make that chicken liver mousse and use the day-old brioche as the bread for it, and you juice those kale stems and you turn that into the sauce. You've just created a dish that has reclaimed every ounce of flavor and had very little waste related to it. And what we find from a business perspective is most chefs, restaurants, culinary businesses are operating on single-digit margins. And so every ounce of that food is worth something, right? The other thing, and just because Haley was on the last panel, is we often don't talk about the food recovery piece. So what you're doing at Pacific Foods is so amazing, and also how we're treating this issue within these communities, because Beard is a lot of restaurants where a lot of people can afford to eat, right? And so then how do we actually take this message out and engage the communities, both one related to food recovery, so there's dignity in that food as it's being presented to folks, that it's culturally appropriate, and that it's not presented with this aspect of like, well, you get the waste, right? Because that's, I don't necessarily want to eat it, you don't want to eat it, and so we can't expect others to want to eat it in that messaging and that narrative. So it's another thing we're sort of exploring is the sort of how we change that narrative around it. I know you and I were talking about that before.
Yeah, I would probably chime in this way. I grew up extremely poor, to the point of where I would get beat if I wasted food. That was not an option in my household. And that's followed me as a chef, is that when I cook and I'm training my cooks, I'm always thinking about what can we do with that food? Don't waste anything. Let's keep our waste down as much as we can. But I think to your point about educating, my philosophy about restaurants is this: there are three groups of people who need to be educated: front of the house, back of the house, and the customer. And many restaurants are still trying to figure out the best ways to educate their clientele, right? So I'm one of those chefs where my attitude is this: front of the house, sell the menu that's in front of you. This is not Burger King. You cannot have it your way. I live in DC. I live in a city where gluten-free, vegetarian, vegan options. I can't breathe air, so therefore you can't give me that dish. It permeates the city, and unfortunately it takes away from the quality of the food. You cannot cook and boil the ocean. You have to be very specific about what you're cooking. If you're cooking a certain cuisine, you have to educate your clients, your customers, your guests about what that cuisine really represents. And if you're trying to be authentic, yeah, you might be able to make some things a little healthier, but you have to be very specific about how you communicate that information to your clientele so that they understand what they're buying when they come in. You educate the back of your house by saying, look guys, let's be creative and let's think of ways that we can continue to use what we have to create specials, to make more dishes without throwing a lot of food away. And that's an important aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, we try to take a more subtle approach in the restaurant. It's like, I feel like, especially here in New York, you know, when people sit down at a table to dine at Hearth, I don't really use it as a pulpit to you know, give out education. I mean, we do a lot of education internally, especially the back of the house, to your point, because that's really where all the processing is happening and where we really need to have tight controls and minimize waste to the max. But to your point, I think, you know, use everything and make really delicious food so that they don't even, it's just like on the side and it's subtle, right?
Yeah.
I think you need to keep it subtle, and it's been working for us. I mean, we have a zero waste kitchen. You know, we opened in 2003, and not wasting food was a big mantra of ours that we went out into the world with 15 years ago now, and you know, working with green market farmers and utilizing everything, you know, making stocks and broths. There's so many cool techniques to extract flavor, to utilize product. Again, just simple techniques: lacto-fermenting, understanding acidity, reducing water content, all things you could do at home to really make a difference.
But Marco, you're not, both of you, and Dickie and all the chefs that we work with, you may not do it at the plate on the restaurant, but you're out. I mean, you're on this panel, you're in all these places talking about it. I mean, I think that's, for us at Beard, that's one of the most important things, is that we're constantly talking about it.
We just don't do it tableside.
Whether you do it tableside or not is,
That's
right?
not a feature benefit.
It's not a feature benefit of the restaurant,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
Well, Katherine, when did this start to become, you know, really an issue for, I mean, 2003, you guys, it seems like you're ahead of the curve, really, but in a larger sense for the food community, when people start coming out and start talking about that, I mean, was there There was an event that kind of precipitated that, or just it was something that gathered momentum over time that suddenly this became an issue that it's important for chefs to practice, but also to preach about?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously this is not a new topic, right? This is decades old. There's lots of people that have been dealing with this movement. I think for us, it very cleanly from Beard became a call from chefs who were not educated about the Good Samaritan Act, so didn't know that they could donate food, didn't have infrastructure on how to donate it, right? Didn't have working relationships with food recovery places, even in their own communities. And so they called and they said, what do we do? And we looked around and we said, we don't know what you do, right? So we called experts. We called NRDC, the National Resource Defense Council, we called Rockefeller, we called all of these folks that have been working in this area, and we said, what do we do? They pointed us in the direction of folks like Marriott. They pointed us in the direction of all large-scale folks who were doing this already. And then we just figured out how to introduce it. And over time, I think one of the catalytic items, and I know you guys are going to hear from Chris later today, was the ReFed report, which was corporations, media, nonprofits coming together to define the problem in a way that we could understand, and 2, make it actionable. And we don't have enough time to talk about it, but 3, also looking at policy change. Because a lot of this restaurants can't do a lot and businesses can't do a lot if some of the rules governing the way we do it don't change.
Are there any rules? I mean, I know that might get a little afield, but are there rules that could change that would make this easier? Anything that, when it comes to regulations or anything like that, that might help encourage these kind of practices?
Health department, recognizing compost, citywide compost, statewide compost, anaerobic digesting, right? Federal consistency and use by, sell by dates, right? I mean, there's a whole host of stuff that is easy to do, but just is not prioritized in our current policy environments, either at the city or federal level.
Brad, for you guys, how do you balance that? Because you're talking about, obviously, again, thousands of properties, many different rules, many different regulations, different countries. I mean, how does that affect you?
Well, so regulations are a fact of life. Some are good, some are bad. I think you just kind of live with it. I think there are fewer regulations that actually prevent us from doing what we'd like to do. There are certainly some implications around things like composting, which I'm fully supportive of, but that also has other things that come along with it. And there are some places in the world, you have to have refrigeration in the back. Like I was in Brazil a month ago and shocked actually at how advanced that whole country is in separating every single bit of recyclables and waste and cardboard and food. There were literally at every station in the kitchen there were 5 bins. I just want 2 actually, and 3. They had 5. So the infrastructure of all of those things is really critical to build and put into place, and also to have the market value of compost, for example. 10 years ago, we were doing great in composting, selling it. The farmers they're coming to pick it up, and they were selling it through the system. And then the whole thing went south, and suddenly all of the composters coming to us and saying, now you have to pay us. So there is a market value here that is required to actually make all of this work within a scalable system that honestly becomes the challenge for us as we talk about the numbers of hotels, numbers of locations in different parts of the world, but even different parts of the country. There are food deserts in the middle of the country that is growing, that is the market basket of the world. If you think about parts in the Midwest. So it's not just in the burbs or the inner cities or whatnot. There are places around the world and in the country that don't have the infrastructure in place and yet have the want and the need. So, from our perspective, it really is trying to take this big number of how many hotels we have and where we are in the world and to localize it as much as possible so that part of the community, the hotel is part of the community, they're helping to solve whatever issue that is to solve, whether it's donation to a food bank or creating a group of hotels or restaurants to create a food bank. The other part on infrastructure, we do a lot with food banks around the world, and we do a lot of our own internal education about what liability really means. The Good Samaritan Act was fantastic when it was passed in the early 80s, rarely used. and honestly still very feared that it's not going to be supported. So from a standpoint of creating the amounts of food needed to fill these food banks, I've had food banks tell me, well, unless I can take a half a truckload, I can't come to your restaurant. I can't deal with 50 different line items of product of about 4 to 5 pounds each, which might be a normal course of events from a couple of days in a hotel. So a lot of what we're talking about here, when we get into the scale, is where we need to be a lot more creative. And I think the folks in this room and this entire organization, I've known Danny for a number of years on this, and really it's been phenomenal what's going on. This is the kind of conversation that we need to be able to reach our goal of 50%. And our goal of 50% is to reduce it from the landfill. And
So that's 50% that would have otherwise gone to landfill.
percent was going to landfill. We are really, and we're trying, and we hope that's going to be a much bigger number than that by a number of different avenues. But the first place to actually start is awareness within the kitchen, awareness within the organization, and actually measuring it. And before you measure, you got to separate. So again, we need 2 cans back there.
And from the measurement, I'm curious, both the measurement and the planning, whether there are tech solutions that might help, deal with that?
A lot of tech out
50%,
there.
yeah.
There's some great tech. There's some cloud-based tracking that you can generate these incredible reports. Remember, all of this is also built on a labor base. And when I started, where charcuterie was a big thing, and everybody was making, culinary was more about what do you do with the non-great bits and pieces. How do you build something out of the excess, the waste, the non-tenderloin? Charcuterie was a big deal. Honestly, a lot of that has gone, and it's come back a bit now with real artisans, but a lot of that has gone away simply because there is not the staff to be able to execute that. And there's a lot of great pate that actually is meatloaf. So we prefer not to have that.
That's a little alarming. Dadisi, we talked about the back end of restaurants when it comes to education. I mean, are there, is it hard to educate on that level? I mean, do you get resistance at all when it comes to bringing these lessons to your restaurants or those? Because I'm just guessing, again, that's a high pressure job, a lot of work, to also keep this in mind as well when you're doing the work.
Right. I think it depends on the type of staff you have, right? So if you get a guy or a woman who has been doing this a while, it may be difficult to teach them new things because they're accustomed to doing things a certain way. If you get a green young person who's really interested in learning from you as the chef, then that's a kind of an open canvas that you can kind of work with and guide them in the right direction. But I think a lot of it just simply has to do with the leadership in the kitchen as a whole, right? It's a new time now. So I'm on the cusp of Gen X and baby boomer. The things that were done to us in the early days in the kitchen, you can't do that with millennials. It just won't work.
True.
And I know these guys are
An
laughing.
entirely other very interesting panel. I'd love to hear.
Yeah. So what I'd say is that one of the challenges we're having in the industry as a whole is the talent pool, skill base. To your point, having people who really understand how to cook, they understand techniques, and they understand the philosophy of what goes on in a given kitchen. And even though we have a plethora of culinary schools which are doing their job, I'm a big proponent of apprenticeships. I think it's important that young people find a chef who's willing to work with them and teach them and train them up. And some people are doing it, but we've kind of gotten away with that, from that, because we're talking so much about sending them off to school. They need to just get in the kitchen and work and learn it. And then as they learn it, they start developing a passion around the things that we're talking about right now. Respecting the food, understanding how to control the food. To Dickie's earlier point when he was talking about portion controls, I think more and more restaurants need to start looking at that as a part of their menu development. Like, what are you developing? If the whole plate is completely full with food, a lot of that also is regional. It depends on what region of the country you're from in terms of what people look for on a plate, right? So, to my thing is that education, and more education is always important. If you have the right leadership in the kitchen, the people will receive what you're saying because you're teaching them. and you're training them, and you're not belittling them, you're helping them grow, and you're uplifting them as chefs. And that's what we need more of in the kitchen.
Just a quick point. I really think everyone needs to spend more money on food. I think it's, seriously, I think,
Chef's attitude, I hear you.
I think, listen, it sounds counterintuitive, but I think the more value we place on food and the more money we spend on food, the more inclined we may be to not throw it away. And we have to stop producing so much cheap food in this country. And I think that will really, really start helping to make a difference. And, I like to use the metaphor of like the $4,000 leather jacket that you spend on and that you take care of it for your entire life. And I think we just need to value food more, and we need to spend more money on food as a culture in this country.
Yeah.
To open it up to the audience for any questions for our panels. Let's see right down the front.
Hi, my name is Katherine, and I'm the founder of Greenland, a line of frozen.
Sorry, here's a microphone.
Oh, thank you. A line of frozen smoothie products that taste good, do good, as we work with farmers to source their imperfect and surplus produce. And more so focused kind of on Marco and Brad and Dickie. What are you guys doing to work with your suppliers upstream to start tackling waste before it gets to the kitchen?
Baldor does a scraps program, which is really cool, and they sell so many carrot sticks, which is kind of, that market, and our kind of obsession with convenience is part of the problem of our food waste in this country. And it's like pretty soon you're going to be able to buy a peeled banana, which is just psychotic. Yeah, wrapped in plastic, and it's just crazy. So Baldor, they sell a lot of carrot sticks and a lot of diced carrots, and guess what they have? A lot of the peels. So, and it doesn't work at scale, but it works, for restaurants like Hearth. And we get organic carrot peels, and we use that in our broth, and they're probably more nutritious. There's obviously a nutrient conversation to be had around food waste as well, because most of the stuff that goes in the garbage is actually the most nutritious stuff, which is a whole nother panel and conversation. So we do what we can to talk to our farmers and to talk to our purveyors to see what's out there, and you just have to keep on asking questions, and it's a constant negotiation.
I agree with that. I think at scale, it's imperative that we work with the suppliers and work with the entire system, the entire delivery system, and to be able to go back to the producers and say, this is what we want you to produce, and this is what we deem as acceptable. It might not be what we deemed in years past. It might be that perfect was the enemy of good as it relates to food. And it might be that we actually want you to use more of the ugly carrots and don't just send us the perfect, beautiful carrot that looked like it came out of a cartoon. But that's a big conversation, because in many cases there is machinery built specifically for a particular shape and size and weight of a particular item. There are seeds that have been bred to fit that machine. There are cuts that have been applied to fit the whole system. So if you're one or two restaurants, you can do anything. If you're 10,000 is where we get into a lot of the challenge, what we're talking about. And in order to actually make a change in the scale, we have to go back to saying, okay, listen, we're buying convenience vegetables for those that are buying it for a number of reasons, but primarily because of labor. Because it's a lot cheaper to pay another 40 cents a pound for a peeled and diced carrot than it is to pay somebody 20 bucks or 50 bucks an hour here with benefits and whatnot. So there is a financial reason first why these decisions have been made. And we have to go back to changing the reason that we made that decision, working with people like yourselves to say, hey, you're actually providing a new delivery distribution system for a problem that we're trying to help the rest of the industry with. We want to help you. So we are looking for, let me get your card afterward. We are looking for a lot more organizations like yourselves that are actually going through and being that middle person so that we can buy better and buy differently. But that's really what it comes down to.
Hi, my name is Beth Mitchum. I'm from the University of California, Davis, and director of the Horticulture Innovation Lab. And for the past 30 years, I've worked on maintaining the quality of fruits and vegetables after harvest. But my question to the panel is, how has food safety concerns and policy impacted your ability to save food? And do you have any creative ideas about how you can deal with these two very important challenges while still trying to save food?
Let's take that.
Oh, boy.
I'll take,
I mean,
I'll take that too.
Do you want?
You go and then we'll
Yeah.
come back. We'll come
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, and that is the question as it relates to food donation. Part of my role also is food safety policy, resource, and response. And I want to go into all that, but the first question that we ask is, can we donate this, and are we comfortable that a human ingesting this is going to be, it's going to be safe. So handling of food that is effectively otherwise termed as waste is the most critical part of the process as we talk about what can we save for human versus what can we direct to composting or digesters or whatnot. So that is probably the first question, the first part of the training that we have to say, when the buffet ends and everybody else has gone home, the habits need to be that gets refrigerated and handled in the same way that it was prepared. And that is a training piece, and that's something that we do a good job of, and we're going to do better. Because I think we have a lot more that we can actually save by just putting the emphasis on the handling of it after is as important as the handling it prior.
The problem I see in this conversation as well, it falls down to, nutritious food, and it's like we have a system that supports shelf stability because it's safe, but it's not nourishing. So, the small independent restaurant that's getting organic produce from, the local market is going to have a much harder time passing the health inspection than, your local fast food where everything comes in a box, everything is shelf stable with a very long ingredient panel. And, we need to build a system that supports nourishment and real food. And I think, and that's a big problem that I see.
Yeah, and I think it also, go ahead.
I'm not sure I 100% agree with Marco that things that are shelf stable aren't nutritious. Certainly it's different. So we take it in, find the labels, look, very few ingredients. So there's, what's in there is all purposeful. So when we make our product, we make it from purposeful, very nutritious ingredients. Yes, it gets heat treated, so it is safe and shelf stable. And I would never compare again my bone broth to Marco's, because fresh, homemade is always the gold standard. But when you don't have that time and you want something that you can go to, absolutely we make very nutritious food. And I think, just because it's in a package sitting on a shelf that may have a 12-month shelf life does not mean it's not nutritious and good for you. And back to the food safety standards, certainly that's how we deal with it. That's how we're able to work with the Oregon Food Bank and take ingredients that they couldn't use because we bring them into our facility and we process them away that allows them to be good and we feel good from a safety perspective. So I get some of the view that it isn't as good as your homemade piece, and even to the point where I think frozen's going, but absolutely I feel 100% confident that the food we make with very purposeful, organic, simple ingredient decks, very clean ingredients is very good, nutritious food.
We have time for one more last question, third row right here. I'm very patient, thank you.
Thank you. Karen Hanner, Feeding America. First of all, thank you for all of your partnerships with our food banks across the country. I want to come back to the comment about how the financial tension between valuing food waste and making food more expensive, and then the inherent tension with feeding those families that just can't afford to put enough food on the table at the cost that they are now. You guys are experts in this industry. Can you give me your thoughts on sort of how that tension can be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, not to speak for Marco, but one of the things that we think about at James Beard is it's not necessarily making all food more expensive. It's actually redirecting our dollars to good food, right? And natural food. food prepared with purpose and food prepared in those ways. There's certainly a challenge within the restaurant industry overall of the work, and if you want to pay all the way down the food chain, a fair and livable wage, all the way down to the farmers who pick it, the food is going to have to get more expensive in the restaurant. But one of the things that's so great about scale and purchasing power and forward purchasing and policy changes and all the systematic stuff that we can look at is actually how are we redirecting our dollars from those, maybe those unhealthy processed packaged foods to amazing, delicious alternatives that are created with purpose from thoughtful ingredients with mindful companies. And so I don't think it's always about making it more expensive and less attainable. It's figuring out how we, if you have $5, where do you choose to spend that $5, right? And so what companies, how are we voting with our forks? What foods are you choosing, et cetera? So
I want to go on record saying I don't want food to be more expensive. But I think that there is this discussion about what is the story, so we're selling stories now. Every food has a story, and every restaurant has a story behind it, and it's their ethos or it's what they stand for. I remember when Hearth first opened, walked through it before you guys were open. It was just amazing what people were doing. But there are some cost of doing business now. There are some pieces on this, and my real concern is that's great for what I think Dan correctly said. This is a room full of elitists, and I agree with that. And what are we doing for the rest of the population? And what are we doing with the food that we're actually handling? And my perspective is that we buy differently and buy better with more purpose, and thereby, frankly, keep the cost structure about the same. The reason we're selling 16-ounce, 24-ounce, 48-ounce steaks is because we also want that $65 or $85 average check on that particular plate. There's a revenue piece here. So we've got to be able to build in what's important for our owners. But my perspective is that we can stop talking about food in the generic term of food and talk more about whether the specification or where it came from or what its particular blend is. Talk about it more from a perspective of there is value in that and there is a story behind that, and that story is worth telling and ultimately worth paying for.
All right, thank you so much. I don't want lunch to go to waste, so thank you, my panel. And